As a graphic designer, you're going to be using a lot of different software programs. You might use a software program called Photoshop. You might use a software program called Illustrator or InDesign or something else completely, depending on what you're trying to do. But all softwares use what's called pixels or paths. Some software programs create what's called vector art. Software programs like Illustrator create vector art. And some software programs create what's called raster art, which are comprised of pixels. So vector artwork, which is what you create in Illustrator, it's usually a digital illustration or type you create in Illustrator, is mathematically defined points and dots. And so what's great about vector art is you can scale it really easily. So you can draw something in Illustrator that's really small, and then you can make it really large and put it on a billboard. Or you can create type in Illustrator, that's vector art, and you can scale that type and make it really large or really small. So a lot of times designers like to work in Illustrator to create all their illustrations and all their type. But they might work in Photoshop to bring in their imagery or maybe do something that's really painterly, because Photoshop creates what's called raster art, which uses pixels. And pixels are these tiny dots of information. And what's great about pixels is you can put a lot of different tonality in, and it can be extremely detailed. The bad thing about pixels is it's resolution dependent. So what you bring it in as is the quality that you're going to have to stay with. And when I say bring it in, I mean if you're scanning something into a computer, like an old photograph, for example, you determine when you scan it how much information per inch is captured with the scanner. And that ties directly into resolution. And if you scan something too small with not enough detail, then it's really, really difficult later on to make it look good if you need to print it at a certain size. So how is resolution determined? Resolution is measured in what's called DPI, or dots per inch. And it's literally the amount of pixels per inch of the artwork. And all pixels are these little dots of color. And in the computer, these dots are comprised of actually 3 colors: red, green, and blue. So pixels are all tiny dots of information put together to create a lot of detail. And the thing that's kind of tricky is resolution changes depending on whether you're working on a screen or whether you want to print something. So the ideal resolution for something that's printed, so for example, if you have an 8.5 or an 8 by 8 inch photograph and you want to print it and you scan it in at 8 by 8 at 300 DPI, and then you work with it in Photoshop, you can print it out at 8 by 8 at 300 DPI, and that's great. But if you just want to show it on your computer screen, the resolution is much smaller. It can be 72 DPI. So resolution for print is 300. Resolution for the screen is around 72. And these are just, approximations. 72 is sort of the approximation for the screen, and 300 is the approximation for print. But you can't print something out on the screen. So if you have something that's 8 by 8 inches at 72 DPI, or they call it PPI, pixels per inch on the screen, and you try and print that out at 8 by 8 inches, it's going to look interpolated and blurry. So you always kind of determine this when you either bring something in on a scanner or when you're in Photoshop, because the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator is Photoshop is dealing with photographs and digital paintings and things you bring in, and that's done with pixels, and it is raster, and so it's going to be resolution dependent, and you need to decide how many pixels you want in the artwork. So this is something you would deal with. So for example, if you look at the pixel dimensions at the top of this graphic, the actual file size is 7.32 megabytes. The total amount of pixels in the image is 1,386 by 1,385. And the resolution, or the pixels per inch, is 72 at 19.25 by 19.23 inches. So it's a little bit complicated. You're looking at the file size, which is usually measured in bytes, kilobytes, megabytes. You're looking at the resolution, which is measured in pixels per inch. And then you're looking at the total pixels. And the total pixels is really only something you would do if you're a web designer. If you're dealing with print or something that's going to be printed out in any way or form, you're going to deal with resolution per inch. And if you're trying to just clarify it in your mind, you can look at the width and the height in inches by the resolution, and that will tell you how big it can be on the monitor. So for example, this document can be 19 by 19 inches on the monitor and look great because it's 72. But if you wanted to print it, you would have to get it to 300. And the problem is you can't really make something have pixels. You can eliminate pixels, so you can make something smaller in Photoshop, but you can't really make it bigger. So you can't add in pixels without making it look a little bit blurry and soft. So thinking about resolution is important. You have to think about how much resolution there is per inch if you want to print something, remembering that 300 dpi per inch is for print and 72 ppi per inch is for the web. And then there's all these different types of files you can save your document as, and those files are measured in bytes, kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes. So you've probably been using different file types and file sizes for a long time, so that might make more sense to you. But this is just sort of an approximation of what you would be looking at if you're a web designer and you're thinking about different screen sizes and you want to calibrate how many pixels per inch in that screen and what the resolution would be.